So we should be welcoming in our participants now to Jaipur Literature Festival in Colorado's live session on dismantling racism, decolonizing systems. And I will let people enter for a few minutes before we actually begin. And I introduce our very special panel. I'm just so delighted and honored to be presenting to everybody tonight. People seem to be entering fairly quickly tonight. We'll just wait a couple more minutes. I'm going to make Jules a co-host. For those just entering, we're giving it a minute or two so people who've been in the waiting room can join us before we get started, which will just be in another minute. See people greeting each other in the chat, which is sweet and lovely. So you're welcome to do that. Trying to arrange my screen. Okay, everybody, we're getting there. So I'm going to begin with welcoming everybody again. I think this is our 6th spring, summer COVID special virtual series of sessions, which the Jaipur Literature Festival, as some of you know, one of our foundational tenets is diversity and international diversity, as well as of the Americas. So we've always made it a point, especially in these summer sessions and with our local authors, to really try and be featuring diverse authors. And then after our first 2 virtual sessions, this amazingly positive and excruciatingly painful uprising and crying for social justice arose with the horrible murder of George Floyd. And we pivoted most of our sessions towards a conversation on dismantling racism. And we've been really honored and pleased to have the opportunity to have that be a continuing conversation looked at from various angles, and a deepening conversation rather than a one-off. So that's been really, really meaningful for us and for our audience. And I thank all of you. The organization presenting this session tonight is JLF Colorado, the Jaipur Literature Festival at Colorado. And for those of you who may not know, the Jaipur Literature Festival began in India about 13 years ago, and within a few years was the largest literature festival in the world. It was an explosive phenomenon, has inspired over 200 literature festivals throughout Asia, Africa, the Middle East, places like Dhaka and Lahore, and places where it's not a given or such an easy endeavor to pursue free speech or controversial conversations. But what many people in the world have become aware of is this longing, this earnest desire and for deep conversation and understanding. And we have the opportunity to present some of the deepest thinkers and writers on all the topics of our world to help fulfill this quest for insight and understanding. Some very strange set of coincidences. I ended up being able to bring the Jaipur Literature Festival to Boulder, Colorado, a much smaller iteration 5 years ago. Our 6th iteration this fall will be virtual, of course, but we will have a 6th iteration in November. In the meantime, we've been doing this summer series and have been delighted to do so. The Jaipur Literature Festival in India and in Boulder is a free event. We appreciate donations and we have special levels. You can become a delegate, but it is a free event with access for all. We also do a good deal of outreach work with at-risk students and underserved communities, and with Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and various school districts in the metro area. So we're devoted to the free dissemination of knowledge and cultivating humanity in society. So I'd like to introduce our panelists tonight with incredibly honored and with great, great pleasure. Natalie Avalos will also serve as our moderator with the Jaipur Literature Festival. Our moderator also is a participant in the conversation, so I'd like to make that clear to the audience. Natalie Avalos is an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She is an ethnographer of religion whose research and teaching focus on Native American and indigenous religions in diaspora, healing historical trauma, and decolonization. Natalie received her PhD in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara with a special focus on Native American and indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism, and is currently working on her manuscript titled The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal, which explores urban, Indian, and Tibetan refugee religious life as a decolonial practice. She is a Chicana of Apache descent, born and raised in the Bay Area. Janine Canty is a professor of environmental studies at Naropa University in Boulder. As a lover of nature, justice, and contemplative practice, her teaching intersects issues of social and ecological justice connected to worldview expansion and positive change. She is both editor and contributor to the books Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices, and Globalism. There's a typo here, apologies. Globalism and Localization, Emergent Approaches to Ecological and Social Crisis. And a new publication, Globalism, I'm sorry, there's a big typo here, I apologize. Globalism and Localization, Emergent Approaches to Ecological and Social Crisis. Professor Canty has a doctorate in transformative learning and change from the California Institute for Integral Studies and an MA in Cultural Ecopsychology from Prescott College. Professor Enrique Sepulveda is a scholar of Latinx communities in the Americas, Central and North, and Europe, Spain. His people and ancestors come from what is now labeled the Texas-Mexican border. Both his parents and grandparents were migrant laborers and followed the crops since before World War II. Early in his career, he was a bilingual teacher and school principal in California Mexican farm working communities, including labor camps. Enrique has been studying and engaging with Latinx migrants' everyday worlds, their neighborhoods, schools, and their contested conflictual relationships with Western liberal nation states that at once demands and extracts their labor while dehumanizing them in the process. Enrique is interested in documenting how Latinx migrants negotiate, contest, and co-opt global structural and racial forces. And I am Yeah, I'm delighted to now hand this over to our panelists and to Natalie as our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse.
So really, we should start off by just defining what is colonization, right? What is decolonization, but also who needs to be decolonized? And Enrique or Janine, either of you can start. Whoever feels moved to speak. We'll pretend this is a Quaker meeting.
I guess I would want to just invite my ancestors and our ancestors to this moment. My good friend Clint, Carol, and Angel Lawson and her daughter Lily gave me and my daughter sweetgrass. And so a few minutes ago with my colleagues, I lit it and blessed this moment to help us be centered and grounded in these lands that are Arapaho and Cheyenne and Ute and other indigenous peoples. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, before I get started. I guess, do you want to go, Janine, or should I jump in?
Why don't you jump in?
Okay. So one of the things that I always go back to is my schooling in Northern California. And I've been writing about this recently because I'm writing a series of essays. And one of the things that I've already written over the summer was how when I was a 6-year-old child, Spanish speaking, no English, Mexican kid in Northern California, going to an all English, only English public school, and how my schooling experience was my first exposure to white liberal institutions in society. And how as a 6-year-old child, I was measured and had to confront white supremacy and the imperial colonial project of dispossessing me of language, my people's language, the cultural identities, the ways of being in the world and personhood that I was coming in with a 6-year-old kid. So in a sense, I've been grappling with these questions that Natalie and Janine and Jesse and Jules put out for us. I've been grappling with them as a 6-year-old kid. In the first iteration of those kind of grappling was, I remember my parents telling me that my school didn't speak any Spanish and that I had to do my best. And I remember looking up at my parents and probably crinkling my nose and squinting my eyes and saying something to the effect of, ¿Y por qué no hablan español? Why don't they speak Spanish? Like, you know, my 6-year-old self. And my parents just looking at each other, not knowing how to answer. And so those questions that even as a 6-year-old child wondered, why don't they speak this language? Why only English? Was the beginning of this kind of, and so I'll speak more to how that led me on into a process of decolonization of my own self because of my schooling, English only, white liberal institution. And these were mean people, but they were nice, generous, white liberal folk who did some horrible things and symbolic violence and real violence on me in nice, polite ways through schooling. So I would just want to throw that out there for right now, and then I'll develop that more as we go along.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for starting us off and for naming the original peoples of this land, and with starting with rooting in your story, because I really appreciate that. As we started the conversation, and I noticed, you know, we had some tentative space of quietness, and something that just emerged for me was, well, that's decolonizing, because often when we're on a panel in an academic situation, writers, speakers, we kind of jump in so quickly with words rather than taking space. So I'm really appreciating being in this dialogue with Enrique and with Natalie, and just really want to thank everyone for showing up. And your story reminds me that what first kind of opened my eyes to racism was when I was in first grade. I was born in New York City, and my parents, in the Bronx, my parents quickly moved my brother and I out to the New Jersey suburbs. This was in the early 70s, so it was shortly after the Equal Housing Amendment passed. And so my parents were very into desegregating areas, which was somewhat traumatizing for my brother and I growing up. So I went to school in an all-white area. My brother and I were the only kids of color, and I remember being bullied my entire first year. And it was really eye-opening to see the cruelness of little kids, and more alarming to see the adults in those spaces not do anything. So I had this real sense that there was just something wrong with our systems and the way we interacted. And so before we went live, we were talking about what decolonization is, and it has so many different definitions, and I didn't re-look it up, and I don't think I have the classical definition, but for me, so much of it is about undoing. And so undoing whiteness, undoing patriarchy, undoing ableism and gender stereotypes and sexuality constrictions and our body image, being tied to, as Enrique spoke to, one language, a very abstract language, undoing unbridled capitalism and that sense of fierce individualism, and also undoing the sense of linear time and emotional rigidity, and definitely the scientific paradigm that relies just on facts rather than something bigger. And so in terms of what does that mean, and then who needs to be decolonized? I love that, like, well, who does need to be decolonized? And definitely our country and the institutions, mainstream institutions need decolonization. But when we get into it, really all of us do. I think anyone who's living under a globalized corporate reality, which unfortunately is most of us at this point, needs to be decolonized. So yeah, I need to be decolonized.
Thank you. Yeah, so I really appreciate what you both have to say, and Enrique, thank you for starting with that acknowledgement. I think that first and foremost, the way that we should be thinking of decolonization is as a noun and a verb, right? As an action of doing, and also an end goal. And that end goal in a Native and Indigenous context is sovereignty, and really just the complete dismantling of any colonial structure. Okay? And so, like Janine says, the process of undoing is so long, and it's not just about transforming our institutions, it's transforming our structures of knowledge, the ways in which we negotiate power, our relationships to one another. I really appreciated that you said the way in which we privilege materialism and facts as knowledge production, right? A kind of deeply materialist framework. And I think a lot about how knowledge production exists beyond just the cognitive mind or beyond our cognitive functioning, but happens at the level of the somatic, right? Through our bodies, non-verbally, through our relationships with others, human and other than human persons. And so, yeah, thank you for bringing all of those, because I think that's the complexity, is that we are all in various stages of needing decolonization. Because in some sense, we can think of it as a paradigm shift, moving from a deeply white supremacist, settler colonialist framework of that values capitalism, the objectification of people and lands, at, you know, for just the production of capital, single-mindedly, at the expense of relationships, human value, human wellness, human life, all life. So really, decolonization is an entirely different way of living and being.
Yeah, I want to add a very simple term to that, because going back to my childhood experience, the way decolonization manifested was hate. So in the classroom, my teachers would say things like, "Hurry up, Enrica, you have to learn English and become an American." And I mean, those were literal phrases that I heard in my childhood in Northern California, supposedly a liberal bastion. Well, it is a liberal bastion. And the kids in the playground would call me, so American identity, whatever that meant for my teachers, combined with the kids in the playground would call me beaner, wetback, burrito maker, taco bender, and a whole slew of other stuff. And I remember coming home and asking my papi, I said, "Papi, ¿qué significa wetback?" I couldn't even pronounce the word because I didn't know English. And my father just looked at me and he he nodded his head and kind of said, "No importa lo que diga la gente de nosotros. Doesn't matter what people say about us. We are honest, hardworking, decent people." That was my dad's mantra. So after a while, my brother and I would mimic my father's mantra because he would say it so often. But it was his way to kind of counter the hate. And the irony, and this is when I go around talking to teachers, I'd say, as long as I didn't know English, I was okay. I was a Spanish speaker. My Mexican Spanish speaking self was my protection. The moment I began to learn English was the moment I began to learn hate. And that, to me, Americanness and hate were synonymous. And so the learning of English was the beginning of me beginning to have to negotiate and manage and confront and weather the special kind of hate that was reserved for us Mexicans, and continues to be. While I didn't know the significance of the words as a 6-year-old, 7, 8-year-old, but by the time I was 8, I realized, something's going on here that's beyond me. So colonization through language and culture and schooling also meant hate, like in a very real, concrete way. And so, yeah. And so when you said earlier, Janine, the undoing, imagine for a 6-year-old kid, a 7-year-old kid, who's still developing him or herself or their self, having to later on, undo the ugliness that was lobbed and thrown at me as a child.
There's a way in which we become inculcated into white supremacy as a colonial apparatus.
Right.
And then there is a moment in which we get our bearings and try and extricate ourselves from it, right? And ultimately, Enrique, you actually started answering our second question, which are, what are some of the historic patterns of colonization in the U.S. That are pronounced in this very moment, right? That are really ongoing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we look at different social systems, I'm focusing on education, but you see this in law enforcement, you see this in healthcare, you see, and I can give you many examples of how healthcare has its own problematic dynamics. And obviously we know law enforcement, we see this on our nightly news and the way they treat Black people in particular, but also brown people in the way we cage children and people in many areas, but also housing, water, the court system, the occupational job structure. So all social systems are implicated in this colonial enterprise from day one, and we're dealing with that. So I'm focusing on education because that's part of my area of expertise. But yeah, religion is another one that you all can speak to. But.
So in some ways, we could see that the colonial apparatus determines the institutions, all institutions.
Right.
So we become thoroughly interpellated by coloniality and white supremacy.
Right.
And we are made to assimilate and adapt within it, within its hierarchies.
And be measured by scientific instruments, right? So we are measured against a colonial product that we call science, and then rank and sorted and ranked and hierarchized along the way. So yeah.
Yeah, with that question, I agree that pretty much almost every pattern that's historic is still at play in the present. So it's such a big web, a big mess of everything. And then there's just really clear examples, as Enrique was talking about, the police brutality and Black Lives Matter and Brown Lives Matter. I think about so many of the things that are going on right now in terms of the destruction that we're doing to the earth, that even what we now call the US, that was Turtle Island, and how it was all about taking land away from people and seeing land and nature as a commodity. We amped up that worldview. And then a lot of, I think just having the political climate right now and seeing what's happening, and a lot of people are really amped up, seeing the kind of historic roots of this country, the early foundings of the opposition of people that could be allies being divided against one another based on skin color and class and ideology. I think about how whiteness was created in the US as a means for the owning class to have a larger population. So if everyone was white, now they became the predominant majority, rather than having a smaller group of owning class people and then a lot of working class whites, a lot of both free and enslaved indigenous peoples, and a diverse array of peoples that actually could be in solidarity to one another. And we're doing the same dogma now, where we fight against our own interests. Even a lot of folks that are interested in solidarity spend a lot of time demonizing the other political party, which I do too. And a lot of ways, but how we keep creating bigger and bigger rifts based on these systems. And yeah.
So Janine, what I hear you saying is, and this is something I was actually just talking with my class about an hour ago, is the way in which we have become so organized, right? That this colonial apparatus of white supremacy organizes all of us into these specific roles and places. And those of us that live outside the bounds of whiteness are actually managed. You know, there's an intention there. As the US was created, how do you manage Native peoples to indefinitely subject them to marginalization, right? So they are indefinitely removed from power. They will indefinitely never threaten your power. How do you manage African peoples of African descent that have been brought to the US? And then how do you manage those in the West and the borderlands of Mexican-American descent that have been annexed, right? So there is an organization that happens through laws, through structural violence, through even extra-legal violence, extrajudicial violence that we've seen in the case of George Floyd's murder, that those become the driving logics for maintaining a white supremacist society. And that we become totally assimilated and inculcated into those tacit rules. And that we have to figure out then, you know, how do we negotiate life in that world? And I think part of decolonizing is actually just making all those structures visible. Because while they are visible for those of us that live that reality, right, as people of color, the way we experience that, they are not necessarily visible to white folks that are not living that experience of marginalization and dispossession based on being non-white, right? So we have so many different layers of stratification, but we know that that's one of the main driving is whiteness, white supremacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I you know, one of the things that I feel like I needed to get up to speed was with global warming and climate change and the pandemic. I have to be honest. The environmental destruction has always taken second place to human social degradation. But I'm beginning to connect the dots better. That environmental degradation and human social degradation are results of the same capitalist logic. That the extraction, the removal of indigenous people from their lands, the stealing of their lands, the genocidal activities and genocide that we committed, and the attempts to eliminate the native from history, not to mention their land, is part and parcel of the extractive economies that capitalism promotes, right? We extract and we rape and we eliminate biodiversities left and right. And so the pandemic and the police brutality, the public murders and lynching of Black folk, and the caging of people who are seeking refuge, on the border. I mean, these are all manifestations of the same logic, and I'm becoming more aware of that. And I have to be honest, that was a weak point on my part. But as I teach Chicano history and dialogue with indigenous scholars, like my good friends in the ethnic studies department, and my allies and friends in the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm beginning to connect the dots in powerful ways, and in a very real way. The pandemic and the murdering of Black folk has brought that in a way, very powerful way for me. That there's a common root there.
Definitely. Thank you so much for naming that. That's in the heart of my work I think the thing that I'm most passionate about is looking at how the oppression of people and the oppression of earth have always gone hand in hand. And often there's a kind of a larger story that we think that if all marginalized people in the US were quote unquote liberated and everyone was understood white privilege and racism, that suddenly things would be okay. Yet it would only liberate people within the U.S. and other affluent nations to then exploit the global South even more. And you can really look at any large-scale pattern of racism in the U.S. and very U.S.-centric, and it's always about the acquisition of natural resources. And so Enrique named the taking of the land here when colonization happened, and seeing it as free land, that there weren't real people here, and so it was monetary value. And then you can go with the descendants of African American and Black peoples and realize that they were brought here to be a free labor source to work the land. And so once again, it was about the acquisition of natural resources. And then if you look at Chicana and Latina populations, they were already here, once again, similar to Native American folks, indigenous to this place. And again, it was about free or very cheap labor to work the land, farm labor, and then that spreads out to even when the enslavement was banned in the US. A lot of the former slave ships were used to bring Chinese populations to work the land. And so the chain goes on, yet we often think that racism is about certain peoples not liking certain peoples, but not necessarily looking at the economic and environmental factors underscoring that, which I think is so important to this larger narrative.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, that there is a structure.
Exactly.
That says that part of the aim and goal of settler colonialism, and if we think specifically that settler colonialism is about clearing the land of indigenous peoples so that settlers can take over that land to completely monopolize the land, right? And that those peoples that are really collateral damage in this process can be employed and facilitated for the aims of the production of capital, right? That's their ultimate role. And, to speak to something that Enrique said earlier about the kind of like a white liberal project that actually, non-indigenous people, non-indigenous POC people have been inculcated into that project as well. That, part of what the liberal project does in the US is say, well, you as a minority can be part of this upward mobility too. You can have a piece of the pie too. We can contribute to the exploitation of indigenous lands too, right? And so decolonization means actually totally deconstructing that apparatus and saying, we're going to have totally different aims. We're going to live in a completely different way and center Native sovereignty and even consider that the land has its own sovereignty, right? Which is really what indigenous people are telling us, is that the land itself is sovereign and it has its own personhood and agency. So just to move along to another question, which is related, with the current political and economic climate in the US, it's clear that no national leader is going to decolonize this country, right? So how do we individually and collectively start this process of decolonization?
Yeah,
That's that's a loaded question, right?
Right?
One of the things go ahead, Jadid.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
One of the things I try to do with my students, with my daughter, with my friends, my homies back home, is to have like deep, serious conversations to see the mundanity of colonization, the everyday ideological underpinnings of simple things like cartoons, for example. To give you a case in point, my daughter's 12 in junior high, middle school. When she was 5, we go to the cinema to watch Despicable Me 2. And somewhere midway through the film, my daughter and I are eating popcorn. All of a sudden, it's revealed in this cartoon animated film that the Mexican guy is the evil villain. And my daughter, in her plucky, spunky, badass self, turns to me and she's like, "Really, Papi? The Mexican dude has to be the bad guy? Why are you bringing me to this?" And I'm like, yikes. And I said to myself, welcome to my world, right? Welcome to our world. This is the United States. The mundanity of colonialism and empire and its effect on us. And so from that moment, I began to ask my daughter, every time we go to a bookstore, I said, before we start reading, go look for books that illustrate Black people, dark people as the villain or the bad guy. And so we go to a Barnes and Noble, we go to a library, and she starts looking, and 5 minutes, 10 minutes later, she comes running with several books. Look, all the books I found where the dark person is the bad guy. So at a 5, 6, 7-year-old level, that's what we did. After a while, she was hip to that. We would go to a restaurant and she would say, "Papi, guess who are the dishwashers in the back? And and she started seeing how the dishwashers were Black, the hostess was a young white woman, the bartenders were white. I mean, I began to help her see and engage in a dialogue to see the mundanity of white supremacy, of dispossession, people of humanity, Black people, brown people, indigenous people. And so that's one of the things I try to do with my classes, is to help my students to think about everyday discourses, the discourse of DACA, how the university talks about DACA, or how the University CU talks about diversity. Because we in ethnic studies, we don't talk about diversity the way CU talks about diversity, excellence in diversity. We don't do that. Or how the university use poor, vulnerable populations to bring them back to the university in the fall under unhealthy, COVID conditions. They actually said, we're doing this for the vulnerable populations, not realizing that white institutions and white educators have always seen white liberal schools and educational institutions as saving Mexican people, Black people, indigenous people from themselves. We need to save them. We need to bring them to our schools so we can save them. I don't know if the chancellor realized that, but he was tapping into a long history of mundane discourses of how they are the savior and how they position us in everyday things. So that's just a sliver, that's just a piece of the mundanity of race, white supremacy, and ideology, right, that I want to point out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very much chewing on what you just said and wanting to be there, and also want to respond to. And in your last sentence, you use the word savior, and I think that's definitely I guess a meme in our society. I see with the political climate is that people put all their kind of energy in the political system, thinking that somehow someone's gonna make a magic wand and things are gonna be better. I remember when Obama was elected, and there was some interview about, well, what is the, and now that racism is over, what are all of these organizations going to do? And or just there's kind of the superhero complex that if we just get the right person as our leader, things will change. So we become these armchair citizens that just want to choose blue or red, or whatever the binary is. And so we become very self-authored, that we always need someone to tell us what to do and who we are. And so I think that links in again so much with the process of decolonizing is knowing ourselves and breaking the patterns of having to fit into a standardized form. I mean, I would even say even within our own subcultures, there's so much difference and different thoughts and emotions and identities that are at play, that we need to lean into that more and try on what are our kind of more root ways of being, and find kind of what we love and what we love to do, and who we want to be with. I think so much of this is about the local level, and how do we actually get involved with our community and know what people care about, and the places that we reside, and also the non-humans of the places that we reside, and start putting our resources into those relationships and those economic systems, rather than always looking so outward and following the kind of standard pattern of how you make money, what it should look like, and what success is, and kind of making that leap. And it seems like a lot of the young people are doing that with employment and lifestyle. And the more that all of us can start doing that, healthier we'll get.
I love that. Thank you, Janine. Yeah, I think a lot about something that I feel like you both touched on, which is the way in which we become inculcated into a deeply dehumanizing project, right? And that, racism is essentially just a tool for dehumanization to justify the exploitation of certain peoples, right? And so if you could justify the exploitation and naturalize their exploitation, then, that becomes part of your tacit rule of reality, right? And so colonization is partly both visibilizing that, but also in the process within ourselves, how do we rehumanize ourselves, because we become so attenuated to that exploitative power that we've actually all become dehumanized by it. Whites and non-whites, right? We've all become, and I really appreciate what you said, Janine, about the kind of loss of agency. We become such passive agents because we really know, again, tacitly, that we have very little power over what happens in the more meta level, the more national. And so I think that's why folks have started to come out and be more engaged locally, like you're saying, in terms of reshaping their communities, but also local politics, right? The kind of mutual aid that popped up during COVID, the start of quarantine, was just really profound, and to me reflects really what has been multiple generations of community building, because our current state of economic possession didn't happen last year or in the last 10 years. This has been building up. This has been a natural extension of the last, 200, 300 years. And any sort of ruse of middle class or upward mobility, the rug was pulled out from under us. We realized that it was really just a ruse. And so I think the kind of radical reclamation of our power, the radical reclamation of our humanity is the major goal, the major task at hand, and in deciding for ourselves, well, what can our communities look like? How should they function? How do we negotiate lateral power as opposed to, as Janine, we've been so socialized into hierarchical power, right? A deeply kind of white supremacist, but also, I think of a Christian order as someone that's trained in religious studies, the kind of Christian order of like, there's God, and then there's man, and then there's, the plants and animals, and man has dominion over the earth, right? And so, and at some point, maybe the king as an intermediary there, right? That we're used to these hierarchies, we've inherited these hierarchies, and now we can dismantle them. And that's part of our major work, right? Yeah. So we've been talking so much about these cycles of oppression, but also trauma, really. As we've touched on dehumanization and racialization. How do we break these cycles?
Oof. Yeah, that's another, all of these are obviously big questions, and they all seem so related. And I don't know if I'm saying anything that hasn't been said before, but I really like the word disruption and being able to say no. So disrupting the patterns that keep us held in these very rigid spaces of who we're supposed to be. So saying no to the stereotypes and the kind of jobs and the love relations and the futures and the economic systems that we need, that we're told we're supposed to be in. All of those stereotypes and roles that no longer serve, which is a lot of them. And I think the disrupting patterns is so much about not just breaking things down, but then what are we creating? Definitely resonate with the work of Joanna Macy and so many people that are talking about creating a new story. And so we need a different story that is actually inclusive of everyone, and that everyone actually gets piqued interest into maybe making this part of the larger project. So if we have systems that we're creating that start with, well, these people can't be members because they have these types of beliefs, we've already failed. So maybe not being so rigid, but modeling new patterns of health. I think disattending to what's really important, starting with our loved ones, our families, ourselves, the land that we live in, our community, what we really care about. And then, of course, we can't just kind of navel gaze. We need to be aware of particularly of the injustice going on in the larger world and globally, but also being present to one another, and like we're doing tonight, telling a little bit about our stories. So I think just disruption is huge, and I think Natalie brought it up earlier in our dialogue of we actually have to be aware of the habits that we're already situated in to see that they may not be working for us and for those around us.
Yeah, I think that's important, Janine, that the counter stories that, to disrupt the normative, the hegemonic narratives that inculcate, like you said, interpolate us and inculcate in this dehumanizing context. Early on, my mentors and teachers were Chicana activists. I'm one generation removed from the movement of the 60s and 70s. And particularly queer Chicana feminists would say, go back and listen to the stories of your people, of your family, of your grandmothers, of your mothers, and they were very wise in saying that because the moment I did that, I realized that all around me were these counter stories and rich, humanizing, sometimes funny, sometimes ironic, sometimes sad and tragic, but there were stories. And one that stands out is my mom, who was living on the Mexican side of the border. My father was on the migrant trail somewhere in Idaho at the time, it was late in the year, because they would leave, my father and his grandfather and uncles and cousins would leave like late February, March to follow the crops, go up to California, Spine, Oregon, Washington, come down Idaho, Colorado sometimes, or Utah, back down to the Tex-Mex's border. And my father was gone, and so she was about to give birth to me, my mom. And when her water breaks on the Mexican side of the border, she calls her brother, who takes her to the bridge spanning the Rio Grande River, or Rio Bravo, as they say on the Mexican side. And my mom crosses the border, contractions and all. On the other side is another uncle waiting on the Texas side. And I'm born, hours later, I was born in Eagle Pass, Texas. My family straddles both sides of the border for many generations. And later on, I retell this story in a social context in grad school. And my queer Chicana feminists were like, Enrique, don't you see it? As she crossed this fiction that we call political border, a cultural, regional, geographic border, you were crossing her birth canal. Mm-hmm. And into this world. And pains and all, struggle and all, your mom was birthing you into this world of borders. And I was just like stunned, but it's one example of how queer Chicana feminist perspectives helped me to open up and see these counter stories that were right in front of me, that my mom had told us, all our lives. And what I would learn later as I contemplated, as I followed their lead, my mom and my queer Chicana friends, was that the place of displacement, the bordered life of dislocation, the space of uprootedness and rupture was actually the site of growth. And that untethered, that unrootedness, that unmoored reality, because I was, my cousins would say I'm not Mexican enough. My friends in California said I wasn't hip and cool enough, and I wasn't white enough. I wasn't American enough. But that place of not belonging, of not being the norm, was actually the place that I was going to find my way forward. And that's so these counter stories that are around us are what queer Chicana feminists helped me see, was that was going to be my road to a greater sense of self and groundedness. There's more to say about that, but I'll stop there.
I think that, just to speak to this question again, as how do these cycles
You just froze.
exactly right.
You're freezing.
Oh, we have freezing. I don't know what to do.
I think Janine maybe wanted to comment or
Yes.
respond.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in until Natalie comes back. Oh, there she is.
Oh, there she is.
You froze for a
Okay.
moment, Natalie. So maybe say your last like 5 sentences, word for word. Oh no.
Trauma.
You're frozen. You
And,
froze again.
Oh no.
Oh, there you are. You're back.
Okay. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate that story, because I think that part of, where we were trying to end and go to is healing. And I think that there's a way in which, in this process of dehumanization that we've all experienced, we have to put ourselves back together again, right? We have
You're frozen again, Natalie.
So, am I back yet?
Yeah, you're back.
You're
Yeah.
back.
It was the last 20 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep freezing.
No,
But
that's university. I wonder if you turn the camera off. If I mean, not that we want you to, but maybe.
Oh yeah, that helps. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
So basically, speaking to breaking that cycle, I think a major part is telling our stories again, being in a place where we can reorient ourselves to our own histories, and the beauty of our own cultures and knowledges, the beauty of our complexity, even in the shadow of the ways it's been so deeply dehumanized, right? For each of us, for all of us, really. And so how do we come together within ourselves? How do we put ourselves back together again in a way where we are empowered and have agency? And ultimately, as we, how do we become more whole and move forward as whole beings, remaking what I thought was so beautiful, Janine, about what you said, is really making a new world, envisioning a totally new world, and that there's got to be a way to do that. And I think that we're currently in the birth canal, actually, of that process, and that we are in the process of deeply feeling the grief of all we've lost, but also feeling the possibilities, the generative possibilities of moving forward and creating something totally anew.
This is such a deep and beautiful conversation, and I'm appreciating both what Natalie and Enrique just said, and that being birthed, Enrique, from two worlds is a really beautiful metaphor. And as we're talking about kind of healing and wholeness, something I've written and like to speak about is I have a chapter in my first book that I edited called, it's called Seeing Clearly Through Cracked Lenses. And I think this speaks to a lot of what you were saying, Enrique, in terms of, both of you, that we come from a lot of places of that could be called broken or traumatized or not fitting in, yet these are actually spaces of power. This is actually where the healing is coming. And so I actually don't necessarily resonate as strongly with healing and wholeness, rather than kind of like almost the of the tapestries of all of our different, maybe other not belonging, weird bits that generate a different type of power. And so I think that's part of the decolonizing process too, is breaking the narrative that we need to catch up and somehow be this self-realized person that's, you know, healthy and in so many different ways, but almost like getting into the messiness of our not belonging and sadness and whatever those spaces are, and allowing ourselves to exhibit them in a way that like everyone starts feeling comfortable in exhibiting them. I sometimes I crack up. I think the more I teach and study and write, the less academic I become, which I think is a good quality.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think about, if you ever saw that movie, The Revenge of the Nerds, years and years ago, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, it's kind of like the Despicable Me, spoiler alert, but everyone comes up and admits that they're actually a nerd. And so if we could all admit that we're weirdly broken and suffering under these systems in a new type of power. Kind of rambling, but that's where I'm at today.
Yeah, yeah. To that last point about non-academic writing, I over the past year I read, I think her name is Leanne Simpson Berasa-Mosaki, Canadian Indigenous scholar and thinker and writer, who wrote her in her last book, As We Have Always Done, in a non-scholarly way. She's now an independent scholar, but increasingly I'm more drawn to break the boundaries of scholarly writing and write, as my people have done, telling stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely part of our decolonial journey, is to redefine knowledge production and what is valuable and viable knowledge, and to bring meaningful philosophical knowledge back into the center of our lives, and to also move past our materialist binaries where we can understand that the world is not material and immaterial, but actually that the immaterial is expressed through the material. So yeah, these are major goals here. I know that we're supposed to move on to Q&A. So Jesse, should we basically just ask for questions in the comments?
Yes, the easiest way has been for people to type their questions in the chat. And there is one here. I mean, the chat has been very active with some great conversation and comments. It's awesome. But here's one question as well from Laura Malaver. Amazing panel. Can you speak to how racial formations impact the very categorizations that the colonial apparatus of white supremacy engenders? Who belongs to a race, an ethnicity? Who gets eclipsed as culture only?
Well, you know, let me kind of speak a little bit to it in a roundabout way. When I was in grad school, I was studying under a well-known, amazing scholar, anthropologist at UC Davis, Karen Watson-Gegeo, who I love to death. She's been an amazing mentor. And she had us do an activity in our ethnographic methods class to go back and interview people in our community to understand the cultural context of our community in the diaspora. A lot of us were in the diaspora. Anyway, so one of the words was about culture. And so one of my colleagues came back who was Hmong. This was in Sacramento, California. He came back and told us, and a lot of us were being trained as anthropologists and ethnographers in anthropology. And he says, I didn't realize at a time, but when I was interviewing in my community, we don't have the word culture in our language. this was like, we were like, what? Of course, we're, learning this stuff, but my mentor, loving mentor, launched into this whole lecture about how culture was developed by European thinkers in the 17 and 1800s to categorize people along both racial lines and cultural lines. Of course, they pitted themselves, European people, at the apex of the cultural matrix of categorization. So Lau, bringing that question up, reminds me of how even our language of races and categories, like culture, is implicated in the colonial project of Western civilization, in not only trying to make sense of diverse people out there, but in naming their diversity, ranking them, sorting them, and categorizing them along a racial Western civilizational matrix. So even our language is, to be blunt.
Yeah, I thank you, Lau, for that question. And I think that the colonial apparatus, as we noted earlier, is driven by racialization. It necessitates racialization. You need it in order to order bodies and justify the dispossession of those bodies, right? And organize them and manage those bodies indefinitely. Right? But I really appreciate what Enrique said about even the category of culture. Part of what happened in that moment as the colonial apparatus is developing, it's developing in conversation with the Enlightenment Project, right? So the Enlightenment Project is trying to discover and understand all the universal laws. How does the world work? What are the natural laws that govern the universe? What are the natural laws that govern societies and quote unquote cultures? And then what are the hierarchies of these cultures and peoples? And oftentimes the ways in which they'd be initially ordered is through religion. So, in a pre-modern context, especially during the Reconquista, Spaniards ordered themselves as superior to Jews and Muslims, right? And then that idea was brought to the New World and was really just essentially became part of the Enlightenment Project that was present among English Puritans that came to the US, that they themselves had, through their relationship, through their providence, through their relationship of grace to God, had the rights to cultivate and take over lands. And so when we think about culture, I think it's always used in service of empire here. And so I think that's one entry point to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be still chewing on what everyone just said. But I think it's also kind of going back to looking at the ties between racism and ecological oppression, to remembering that indigenous peoples, whether from Africa or from Turtle Island or wherever, are actually people of a place. And so it wasn't as much based on scientific genetics, but people being at home in a community to a place. And so when we have these sweeping categories of Black or Native American or Chicana, Asian American, whatever it is, they don't necessarily tie it to a homeland. And it becomes really dehumanizing because it's the narrative in terms of where do you now fit in in terms of the story of whiteness and racism.
So I don't see any more comments or any more questions. So I will speak to this a little bit more, unless Jesse, you can see other questions.
No, there's no actual questions.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
you know, yeah,
Oh,
okay.
here's some
So yeah, that's a great, yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So I think, you know, we've been talking about a US context, but really settler colonialism as an apparatus, it's a global apparatus, right? And something that I think about in my work, because I compare what's happening in the US in, you know, native decolonization with Tibetan decolonization. And so I think of how China has essentially lifted a template of power, used the grammar of race and the dynamics of anthropological racism, social evolutionary racism, to argue that Tibetans were in need of development and to be civilized. And in order to modernize, they needed Chinese to come in and essentially help them in this process. So we can see that that's a global discourse that gets enacted and operationalized in multiple spaces. So yes, is this happening in Palestine? Yes, it is most definitely happening in Palestine. And I think that it leaves us with very difficult questions around how do formerly oppressed peoples get inculcated into power? Well, if white supremacy through settler colonial projects has become the template of power in the 19th and 20th centuries, and you in the mid 20th century are trying to figure out how to cultivate your own autonomy, of course you're going to be influenced by that structure of power. And I think that's all I'll say about that. But yeah.
There seems to be some really, a couple pithy, not even pithy, important questions. And Sopa's question about the Jewish experience of being oppressed and then oppression of Palestinians is really important. I think this goes back to the question that Natalie brought up around the cycles of trauma. And remembering that even if you're in a position of a marginalized population or oppressed population, that actual structure of being traumatized creates the conditions to traumatize others if the traumatizer was actually successful. So it's really easy to fall into that. It's similar to if a child was abused at home, they can more readily become an abuser of their children. And so that happens with cultures. I did see the question from Drew that I did want to comment on. He said, they said, is culture necessarily colonialist? And how so many people within the US feel like they don't have any culture. And I think this is really important. A lot of my students will talk about that, and we talk about it when we look at cultural appropriation, particularly with people more New Age, taking traditions of Native American tribes, and how many people just kind of want a tradition that's more spiritual. And I think for me, it goes back to culture needs to be embedded in a place. It needs to be a relationship with land. And so while we don't want to take someone else's culture, we do all want to become indigenous to a place. So knowing the watersheds and the animals and our other human animals and those places. And of course, we do want our the stories of our ancestors and relatives, but that doesn't necessarily have to be culture or religion that comes in like a specific package. It should be actually, I think, different for all of us, depending where we live.
So I would add that I think culture, if it's not deconstructed and critique, it is colonial. It comes out of the colonial project. I mean, anthropologists were fundamental players in the colonial project. I mean, as an anthropologist trained, I had to contend with that. So I really want to go into this discipline. Luckily for me, people before me, feminists, post-colonialists, ethnic studies folks, deconstructed anthropology enough for me to say, okay, I can wrap my brain around it. But I'm thinking about the book of Norma Gonzalez, Chicana anthropologist, who wrote "I Am My Language," and she's looking at Mexican-American parenting and motherhood and mothers. And one of the things she says, I think the book is about 15 years old now. She said at the time was, the word culture is exhausted. It's an exhausted term. We expect too much of it. We demand too much, and it doesn't do what we expect it to do. And so she talks about cultural formations and processes. And so it's interesting, culture as it was defined, and even up to the present, people think of culture as this bounded, clean-cut, demarcated group of people that are uncomplicated and unmessy. And a lot of the elements that define culture in that way are prescribed. So it doesn't lend itself to complexities, multivocality, multidimensionality, multiple identities, and whatnot. And so she argues that we need to move away from that colonialist, simplistic way of looking at complex humanity. We're much more complex than these categories have us believe, not to mention the colonial aspects of it. So, so going back to what some of you have said, we're birthing new language. We're in the birth canal zone coming up. I'm thinking of Lao's term recovecos. We are birthing new language to make sense of our predicaments as we decolonize ourselves.
Oh, go ahead. There were a couple.
Well, there's a question that I want to address from Mecca. How, in your opinion, does or can decolonization fit into the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation? So I'm actually going to turn off my video in case so you can hear me clearly, because I don't want to cut out here. I think that they don't align, actually, because I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations have a tendency to domesticate issues of insurgency into a white liberal model of power, right? That there is a kind of additive model that, well, you know, we'll just bring in a few more faces of color and we call that equity. You know, you're included in the room, and we'll think about equity in terms of, you know, making sure you have a voice, but we're not going to fundamentally change the structures of power of any institution. And I think that decolonization thoroughly explodes that idea, that you actually have to totally dismantle the hierarchical structure of any institution and rethink it and re-envision it in more lateral, reciprocal forms of mutuality, right? How are we sharing power? How are we moving forward in ways where we are seeing one another's full humanity and even redefining our collective goals and projects? So that's my 2 cents there.
There was one other question down here, unless somebody else was going to respond to that. I didn't mean to. Yeah. Mary said, now there's so much rich conversation going on here. What is the role of violence in decolonization? I can think of different things that are meant by that question, so I'm not sure what this person means. Is there a role of violence in decolonization?
Actually, I'm happy to speak to that because I was talking about violence with my students this week. Because they, you know, since class started, all they've wanted to do is talk about what's happening. And a lot of the debates that have been taking place in the public sphere have been about shaming and disciplining protesters because of what is perceived to be quote unquote violent behavior. And what we don't see is that all the structures, all the structural racism around us is violence. It's structural violence.
Yeah.
And so what people are responding to is generations and generations, centuries of violence imposed upon them that they can no longer tolerate, that they can no longer assimilate, and they can no longer, they will no longer negotiate. And I think that in some ways, as Janine noted earlier, we've been socialized out of our power and our agency, but also out of our need for righteous rage. And as a Buddhist, I thoroughly support righteous rage. I thoroughly support wrathful responses to injustice, because I think that we have to call out with clarity and ferocity that which is so deeply unjust that it can no longer be tolerated, right? And so I think that violence has a role. I think that violence can be a legitimate response to these deep, deep structures of dispossession.
I actually have a question, if I'm allowed. Is there a conundrum around white supremacy, the center, the power structure, having both, maybe, don't know, having the power to help decolonize, because that's where a lot of power lies, and yet that power being part of the colonial project itself? Paradox. And when I think where part of it comes from is that a lot of white people end up, I want to help. Am I being a jerk? Am I being a jerk? Am I being overstepping? Oh no, I want to get out of the way, but no, I want, you know, how can I help? I want to hand you the, you know, it's like, I'm the white savior. I'm the, you know.
So I saw this incredible meme the other day that said, you know, when white folks understand white supremacy and racism as a problem for white people to solve, as opposed to a problem that they need to sympathize, you know, around others for, right? Because it really is. And ultimately, you know, yeah, we're each, me, Janine, and Enrique, we're each doing our different kind of work. But ultimately, the work should and can be driven by white communities interrogating their own power, asking themselves, what does it mean to give up power? How am I complicit in the disempowerment and dispossession of others? How do I talk to those in my family that are ignorant of these topics and these ideas and help them understand them? And how do I restructure these dynamics in my workplace, in my home, in every place that I exist? And when that happens, I think we'll see some major changes.
I definitely agree. And I also, something that was helpful for me is just realizing and encouraging white people to realize that they're actually oppressed under systems of white supremacy. It's not the quote unquote marginalized people of color that are the only oppressed people under the system. White people lose so much power under white supremacy. The power to be different, to feel emotions, to not be authored by religion and science, doctrination, to have loving relationships, to break heteronormity, like so many different things, to have so many different types of relationships. And so when when it's in the agency of white people having all this power and privilege that they need to give up, I think they have to also recognize that they're at extreme disadvantage because they're not aware and awake to these things. And so they're not starting, in some ways, an economic system and those systems of privilege. They're like starting on third base and then they get a home run and they're wow. But in other bigger systems, they're like not even on the field. And so like come into the field and see what that means, that you're living in a sheltered, somewhat ignorant world, and then come to this place of the work through that lens, rather than you want to help all of these people of color.
Right, but yes, but I'd like to acknowledge that I didn't mean it to sound as diminished as that from my perspective.
No.
But yeah, but exactly that if like building that awareness, which will take a lot of work, and but then also acknowledging that that power can be then used in that subversive way of undoing your own power. Yeah. It's tricky though. I mean.
Yeah, I was thinking that that I've spent most of my life and career undoing and looking for ways that people in my community undo colonialism, empire, and white supremacy. That I have failed in looking at how white people might do that. And so that work, people need to speak to that, right? Just like, you know, like men need to do that work in terms of sexism and heteropatriarchy. Us heterosexual folks need to do that for in that sense. So, right. So I am not perhaps the best person to speak to that, but it is it's important work that needs to happen. Because well, the other thing is things like pandemic and environmental degradation is going to force us to do that. Whether we want to do that or not, we as a species in relationship and interdependence with other species are going to have to go there and do that work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we're kind of at time. I wonder if we should, Natalie, are you going to close us out, or Jesse close us out?
Yes. This has been as deep as it could possibly, this is where we need to go, and then deeper. And I'm so appreciative. I'm just so appreciative. And I think our audience is too. I will be saving this chat and taking a good look at it. We could even share it with those who have registered, because there's some good information in here.
Can you save the chat
yes.
conversation? Okay.
Yeah, it will be in my, Zoom account. It will be there. And so I just want to thank all of you so very much. And, it's almost hard for me to talk. My mind is so full of unpacking so many different streams of thoughts that have come up tonight. But thank each of you so very much. And I greatly look forward to continuing to talk with all of you. And thank you for the incredibly deep work that you're doing and the vulnerability and honesty you bring right to the surface. So more of this. Thank you. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Janine and
Yes.
Jesse and Jules.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you
Jesse.
all.
And our
Thanks,
colleagues out
everyone.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just appreciate the beautiful insights, and I knew that this was going to be a fantastic combination. So
Yeah.
thank you for putting us together.
Oh, my pleasure.
Adios.
Be well, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.